Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danon, will deliver a brief statement about last week's horrific terror attack in Washington, D.C. He will also comment on the latest developments in the region and will take your questions. If you do have a question, please remember to state your name and outlet. Thank you.
Good morning. Last week, two young people on the diplomatic staff at Israel's embassy in Washington, D.C., Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram, were murdered on the street as they were leaving the Capitol Jewish Museum. They were a couple. Yaron was planning to propose this week in Jerusalem. They were gunned down in cold blood by a terrorist screaming, "Free Palestine." This was an act of anti-Semitic terrorism. However, the gunman was the last link in a much longer chain, one that stretches from hate-filled protests on social media, lies, and to the halls of the United Nations. When UN officials like Mr. Tom Fletcher accuse Israel of genocide, when they irresponsibly claim that, quote, and I quote it now, 14,000 babies will die in the next 48 hours, they are not engaging in advocacy, they are engaging in incitement. That claim was a lie. Mr. Fletcher quietly retracted it, but the damage was already done. It is no coincidence that this statement was made just 2 days before Yaron and Sarah were murdered. We cannot ignore the role that reckless remarks play in fueling violence. Mr. Fletcher and others like him must be held accountable. Meanwhile, Israel continues to act with restraint and responsibility, even in the face of lies. We are facilitating humanitarian aid into Gaza through two mechanisms: the existing track crossings and a new system created in coordination with the US and international partners. Since May 19, almost 9,000 tons of aid have entered Gaza, carrying food, medical supplies, and shelter equipment. In the past 2 weeks, 4 new aid distribution centers were established inside Gaza. 2 of them are already open. Those centers distribute food packages to thousands of families, despite Hamas establishing roadblocks and checkpoints to prevent civilians from reaching the aid. As we speak, there are more than 400 trucks already on the Gaza side of the fence, waiting to be distributed, but the UN has failed to pick them up. We opened the crossings, we provided safe routes for those trucks, but the UN did not show up. So let me be clear, the UN must stop spreading panic and start moving aid. Put your ego aside, pick up the aid, and do your job. Finally, as negotiations for the release of the hostages continue, the facts remain. Israel accepted the most recent deal, Hamas rejected it. We will not stop defending our people. We will not abandon our hostages who have been held for 600 days now. We will not apologize for fighting back against terror. Thank you.
Ambassador, hi, thank you very much. Yvonne Murray, RTE News. Israel's losing support amongst European allies. Your own former Prime Minister has accused Israel of carrying out war crimes. There are hostage families protesting on the streets of Tel Aviv. Are you feeling the pressure now to stop bombing the people of Gaza?
Well, we are not bombing the people of Gaza. We are fighting a terrorist organization. And as I said very clearly, we have 2 goals in this war. We haven't finished the job. We will not finish the war leaving behind 58 people. There are families waiting for them, and we are committed to finish this war by making sure the hostages are back and Hamas is out of the game.
Ambassador Sidhwa with China Central Television. My question is on West Bank. You said many times here that Israel is the state of democracy and rule of law, and this is what exactly happened with our Chinese colleague in West Bank last weekend during the what many people call Jerusalem Day. His equipment has been damaged and he has been verbally discriminatively abused. Can you explain a little bit what kind of rule of law is this, especially the law enforcement, when they saw those kind of things, they left?
So I cannot relate to what you are showing me, but I would appreciate if you send me the information, and we were going to look into this incident. But we are a democracy, and we are proud of it.
But should the police protect journalists there?
So there is freedom for journalists in Israel, and we have seen it all over the years. If there was an incident, we will look into that.
Mr. Ambassador, Amiri with the Associated Press. Can you talk about what happened yesterday at the Gaza humanitarian aid site? UN says 47 were wounded, apparently by Israeli fire. Gaza Health Ministry says 48 wounded, 1 killed. What happened yesterday?
So first, let me make it clear. We don't run those centers. We provide security for the surrounding area. As for yesterday, it was the first day. You know, there were a few riots. It took the American teams some time to take control of the situation, but I can say it out loud, we didn't shoot anyone over there. There were like reports about helicopters shooting people and those kind of things. It didn't happen.
Not even warning shots?
No, not by us. Not by us.
Ambassador Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera English. One of the speakers we're expecting to hear from at the meeting today is an American surgeon who's been in Gaza and has written and spoken publicly about his experience there, saying that he witnessed children deliberately targeted and shot, often in the head, during the ceasefire even. How would you respond to the allegations that he's raised that Israeli soldiers have been taking the lives deliberately of children there?
So I will listen to his words. You know, I think it's important to bring briefers from both sides. We have asked that there will be briefer that will speak about our suffering. Unfortunately, it will not happen today. I hope it will be more balanced in the future meetings. But I agree with you. There is suffering in Gaza, but the blame is on the shoulders of Hamas. Hamas that started the war, and Hamas that is not willing to lay down their weapons and release the hostages. So there will continue to be suffering until Hamas will understand that they will not stay in Gaza. Yes, please.
Now that the Gaza humanitarian foundation is up and running, is Israel planning to still allow the UN to deliver aid into Gaza, or will you make a
So at this stage, we have both tracks. You know, I call it the old one, which is the tracks, and the UN should move faster and be more helpful on this issue. They complain a lot, and they should be more cooperative. And at the same time, there is I would call it the US centers. But I think the problem is that some people look at it as a competition, and I think it shouldn't be the case. I think the UN should put their ego aside and cooperate with the new mechanism as well.
And then can I just clarify your remarks on Tom Fletcher? Are you blaming him for the deaths of the 2 embassy staff in DC?
So I think he is responsible for inflaming the situation, and I will elaborate on that. First, he came to the Security Council and used the term genocide. That was irresponsible. That was not his role, no legal claim for that. Then he continued and blamed us for killing 14,000 Palestinian babies, which was a lie. It didn't happen. And only 2 days ago, he put out another provocation saying that there are 10,000 trucks waiting to enter Gaza. That's another provocation. You know, if you line up 10,000 trucks from the border with Gaza, it will actually be a line until the border with Lebanon. From where he's bringing those numbers? He should be more responsible when he puts out those statements. Thank you very much.
The 9,923rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel and the United Arab Emirates to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objections, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mrs. Sigrid Kaag, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process at Interim, and Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to Ms. Sigrid Kaag.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Security Council, the Middle East region is undergoing a seismic transformation, marked by volatility, but also by opportunity if seized and supported. Its people demand a future of justice, dignity, rights, and peace. There can, however, be no sustainable peace in the Middle East without a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are no shortcuts. The region's future will remain bound to its unresolved past unless bold political will and decisions break the cycle. The two-state solution is on life support. Reviving it requires collective action. Peace cannot be a transaction or a partial, temporary arrangement. It needs to be built on international consensus, legitimacy, moving it from managing the conflict to ending it. Mr. President, Israel has the right to live in peace and security. This was undeniably shaken by the horrific terror attacks and the taking of hostages on the 7th of October by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. The suffering of the hostages and their families is immense and profound, affecting the entire country. The release of Eden Alexander on May 12th was a welcome but too brief moment of relief. The hostages need to be released unconditionally, and an immediate ceasefire needs to come into effect. Hamas and other armed groups must stop launching rockets towards Israel. Durable security cannot be achieved solely through force. It must be built on mutual recognition, justice, and rights for all. A better path exists that resolves this conflict, de-escalates regional tensions, and achieves a shared vision for peace. The upcoming high-level international conference in June, co-chaired by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, presents a critical opportunity. It must not be another rhetorical exercise. It must launch a path towards ending the occupation and realizing the two-state solution based on international law, UN resolutions, and previous agreements. A path that unifies the West Bank and Gaza and results in a Palestinian state existing in peace and security alongside Israel, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. We need to pivot ourselves from declarations to decisions. We need to implement rather than adopt new texts. Mr. President, since the resumption of hostilities in Gaza, the already horrific existence of civilians has only sunk further into the abyss. This is man-made. When speaking of our fellow human beings in Gaza, words such as empathy, solidarity, and support have lost their meaning. We should not become accustomed to the number of people killed or injured. These are daughters, mothers, young children whose lives have been shattered. All have a name, all had a future, all had dreams and aspirations. Since the collapse of the ceasefire in March, civilians have constantly come under fire, confined to ever-shrinking spaces and deprived of life-saving relief. Israel must halt its devastating strikes on civilian life and infrastructure. The entire population in Gaza is facing the risk of famine. As the Secretary General has said, families are being starved and denied the very basics. On May 18th, the United Nations was informed by the Israeli authorities of the approval for the resumption of limited aid entry into Gaza. Since then, very limited numbers of goods have entered and have been distributed by the United Nations and its partners. But this is comparable to a lifeboat after the ship has sunk. The United Nations, including UNRWA, will continue to provide humanitarian assistance based on the principles of impartiality and neutrality. We have a plan in line with international humanitarian law and Security Council Resolution 2720. We remain committed to engage with all parties to implement this. We cannot, as has been stated often, participate in any mechanism that violates humanitarian principles. And allow me to reiterate that aid cannot be negotiable, and there can be no question of forced displacement. Civilians in Gaza have lost hope, Mr. President. Instead of saying goodbye, see you tomorrow, Palestinians now say, see you in heaven. Death is their companion. It's not life, it is not hope. Palestinians in Gaza deserve more than survival. They deserve a viable and vibrant future. Ultimately, any sustainable solution for Gaza is political. Agreements and work on post-war arrangements for security and governance should not wait any longer. This includes support for a reformed, revitalized and empowered Palestinian government to govern Gaza and West Bank. And Israel's legitimate security concerns must be met. The region has a vital role to play, with active engagement by the international community. Mr. President, while Gaza rightly captures the world's attention, the West Bank is on a dangerous trajectory. Developments are best described as accelerating de facto annexation through settlement expansion, land seizures, and settler violence. And if not reversed, this will make the two-state solution physically impossible. Israeli security operations in the northern West Bank, particularly in refugee camps, and ensuing armed exchanges have resulted in many Palestinians killed, including children, thousands displaced, and many without home. Attacks by Palestinian militants have also continued, resulting in Israeli civilian casualties, including the death of a pregnant woman. Violence against civilians from any side is never justified. Mr. President, when talking about the occupied Palestinian territory, it is time for the Palestinian leadership to overcome internal divisions and focus on effective and inclusive governance. The Palestinian Authority embodies decades of investment in state building by this very same international community. And the international community needs to continue to support and protect Palestinian institutions. But reforms must continue to ensure the Palestinian Authority's viability, legitimacy towards its own population, and its ability to resume its responsibilities in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority needs to rise to this historic challenge. However, the absence of a political process to end the conflict, coupled with stalled reforms and Israeli economic, administrative and security measures, significantly hamper real-time progress. Mr. President, in closing, I would like to reinforce the following points. 1. Humanitarian aid and assistance urgently need to reach all civilians across Gaza in accordance with international humanitarian law. The UN's position and plan are well known. 2. The people of Gaza cannot afford to wait for the resumption of essential services, livelihoods, and human dignity need to be restored. Early recovery needs to resume immediately. 3. Forced displacement of civilians must unequivocally be rejected and prevented as per international law. Palestinians should be supported to stay on their land. 4. Post-war Palestinian governance and appropriate security arrangements in Gaza are needed that address the needs and rights of Palestinians and legitimate security concerns of Israel. The territorial and political unity of Gaza and the West Bank must be preserved. Fragmentation undermines the prospects for peace and a viable two-state solution. And of course, 6, that can also be point number 1, I'd like to reiterate the unconditional release of hostages and the return of the remains to their families. They need to come home. International engagement and alignment are critical. In the spirit of, to some, a well-known sculpture by Palestinian artist Salman Mansour, 1996, called Palestine Disappearing. I invite you to look it up. We need to act before it is too late. The responsibility lies with the parties and also with us, the international community. We need to act now to reverse the current trajectory. A well-defined, widely supported and time-bound political process accompanied by safeguards and guarantees is essential. Statehood is a right. It is not a reward. Let us not be remembered as the generation that let the two-state solution disappear. Let us be the generation that chose courage over caution, justice over inertia, and peace over politics. Let's be part of the generation that can make this happen. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mrs. Kaag for her briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Council. My name is Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. I am an American trauma and critical care surgeon based in Stockton, California. I come before you today to speak about the Gaza Strip, where I have volunteered twice since October 7th. First at European Hospital from March 25th to April 8th of last year, and most recently at Nasser Medical Complex from March 6th to April 1st of 2025. Both are in the city of Khan Yunis. I'm not here as a policymaker or a politician. I'm a physician bearing witness to the deliberate destruction of a healthcare system, the targeting of my own colleagues, and the erasure of a people. The Constitution of the World Health Organization states that the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent on the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. I've taken this to heart, and it is the reason I volunteer in conflict zones from Haiti to Ukraine to Gaza. In Gaza, I operated in hospitals without sterility, electricity, or anesthetics. Surgeries took place on crowded and filthy floors. Children died not because their injuries were unsurvivable, but because we lacked blood, antibiotics, and the most basic supplies that are readily available in any large hospital anywhere else in the world. I did not see or treat a single combatant during my 5 weeks in Gaza. My patients were 6-year-olds with shrapnels in their heart and bullets in their brains, and pregnant women whose pelvises had been obliterated and their fetuses cut in two while still in the womb. Mothers sheltering in the hospital cooked bread on hot plates in the emergency department during mass casualty events, as we dealt with the rain of fire and death falling around us everywhere. Mr. President, the foundations of life in Gaza, family, health, and community, have been shattered. The medical system has not failed. It has been systematically dismantled through a sustained military campaign that has willfully violated international humanitarian law. Civilians are now dying not just from the constant airstrikes, but from acute malnutrition, sepsis, exposure, and despair. Between my 2 visits to Gaza, I witnessed a sharp decline in patients' health, driven not just by injury, but by worsening hunger and malnutrition that left their bodies weaker, their wounds slower to heal, and their survival far less certain. And let's not forget, this is a man-made catastrophe. It is entirely preventable. Participating in it or not, allowing it to happen is a choice. This is a deliberate denial of conditions necessary for life. food, shelter, water, and medicine. Preventing genocide means refusing to normalize these atrocities. It means refusing to dehumanize the Palestinians, to refuse to see them as calories counted or numbers of trucks moved. We see now that this way of thinking has brought about a human dignity crisis with an entire people on the edge of survival. On March 18th, the ceasefire was violated by Israel. That day, I witnessed the most extreme mass casualty event of my career at Nasser Medical Complex. 221 trauma patients arrived in one morning. 90 were dead on arrival. Nearly half were severely injured children. No health system on earth could cope with this, least of all one that is besieged and starved of supplies. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries. Healthcare workers and first responders are supposed to be protected. Children are supposed to be protected. In Gaza, these protections are simply gone. Every day, the distinction between combatant and civilian is erased. Most of my patients were preteen children, their bodies shattered by explosives and torn by flying metal. Many died. Those who lived often awoke to find their entire families gone. Last year, I published in the New York Times a survey of 65 American healthcare workers who had served in Gaza. 83% of them reported seeing children shot in the head or the chest. I personally treated 13 such cases in my 2 weeks at European Hospital. According to the War Child Alliance, nearly half of Gaza's children are suicidal. They ask, why didn't I die with my sister, my mother, my father? Not out of extremism, but out of unbearable grief. I wonder if any member of this council has ever met a 5-year-old child who no longer wants to live, let alone imagined a society in which so many young children feel this way. And what astonishes me is not that some children in Gaza have lost the will to live, but that any still cling to hope. My Palestinian friends, mostly healthcare workers, no longer speak of resilience or even survival. Parents memorize their children's clothing in case they must identify their remains later. They pray for one piece of bread to give them before they sleep so that their children might die less hungry if they are killed at night. And meanwhile, my Israeli and American friends express horror at what is being done in their names. Many of us cannot understand how our governments continue to arm this senseless destruction, but you in this chamber have the power to stop it. Mr. President, I am here because I have witnessed what is happening in Gaza with my own eyes, especially to children, and I cannot pretend not to have seen it. You too cannot claim ignorance. I urge the Council, and especially my own government, to act with urgency on these enforceable measures. 1, demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire, including a halt to all arms transfers to all parties to the conflict, alongside targeted and lawful sanctions on Israel. 2, demand the reopening of all of Gaza's crossings and guarantee unrestricted medical evacuations, including to hospitals in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where Palestinian patients can be treated by Palestinian doctors, with safe return to Gaza assured. 3, guarantee sustained humanitarian access throughout Gaza, allowing all essential supplies, shelter, food, water, fuel, and medical supplies, to reach all people in need. 4, strongly and explicitly reject the weaponization and politicization of aid embodied by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose executive director, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, publicly resigned on Sunday, citing the foundation's lack of adherence to humanitarian principles. We must affirm support for existing UN mechanisms, back UNRWA, and ensure NGOs with expertise in reaching and providing specialized care to those in need have unimpeded, full access. 5, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. 6, the immediate and unconditional release of all healthcare workers, including Dr. Hussam Abu Sufia, now held in Israeli detention for more than 150 days. And 7, without delay, uphold the UN Charter and act now to prevent genocide. One day, Gaza's survivors may have a record of the empty promises made by the members of this council as their wounds deepened and their lives were lost. If this Council remains silent and fails to act now, that record will stand as a testament to a global failure to provide urgent care and to the collapse of our collective conscience. I'm pleading with you to do what you were entrusted to do, to protect international peace and security, and to prevent irreversible harm. The steps I mentioned are the very least that is needed. I'm asking my own government's representative to hear the voices of the majority of Americans who are calling for the same. If this continues, there will be no Palestinian doctors left, no one to care for the sick and wounded. There will be no Palestinians left to rebuild the healthcare system. We are losing a generation before our eyes, condemning people to die of hunger, disease, and despair, deaths that could be easily prevented. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Sidhwa for his briefing. And I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Coordinator Kaag and Dr. Sidhwa, for your briefings. First, let me express condolences on the tragic murders of Israeli embassy officials Yaron Lichinsky and Sarah Milgram, an American citizen, at a Jewish community event last week in Washington. Yaron and Sarah were murdered for no other reason than the assailant wanted to kill Jews. It is horrific and shameful. We can and must do better to combat the sickening rise of anti-Semitism around the world. May their memories be a blessing. I think it's worth noting Yaron's final post before his murder on the social media platform X addressed anti-Semitism at the UN. Specifically, it condemned Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Tom Fletcher for spreading anti-Semitic lies. When he addressed this council on May 13th, Under-Secretary General Fletcher used language invoking the charge of genocide against Israel. Last week, he claimed that 14,000 babies were about to die within 48 hours, an abject falsehood. These kinds of remarks are absolutely unacceptable for an official in his position. Last week, Yaron and Sarah were murdered simply for attending an event for young Jews. The irony? The event discussed finding ways to bring aid to Gaza. But that didn't matter. They were targeted because of who they were. The United States has been working tirelessly to free the hostages and bring this war to an end, one that Hamas brutally started. Yet in the most delicate of moments, some member states remain unwilling to condemn the terror group responsible. Forget that these actions endanger hostages. The actual outcome is condemning civilians in Gaza to remain under Hamas's control for another generation. For our part, the United States will continue its effort to bring about a diplomatic agreement that will free the hostages. Hamas continues to reject proposals from the United States, Qatar, and Egypt that would release the 58 remaining hostages who have now been cruelly held for 600 days and bring calm to Gaza. Every day, Hamas demonstrates its lack of regard for the Palestinians it claims to represent, all while it violently suppresses protests against its barbaric rule and diverts aid meant for civilians. The United States fully stands behind Israel and its right to defend itself. In order to move forward, Hamas must be defeated. As Secretary Rubio has said, if an ember survives, it will spark again into a fire. There can be no peaceful and prosperous Gaza as long as Hamas governs it by force. The Council should apply pressure on Hamas to disarm, leave, and free Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas's tyranny. Shielding Hamas from accountability only undermines Israel's security and prolongs Palestinian anguish. Hamas must release the hostages immediately, including the bodies of the 4 murdered Americans it continues to hold: Itai Hen, Gadi Huggy, Judy Weinstein Huggy, and Omer Nutra. We will not rest until every hostage has been returned from Gaza. Let us be clear. This council should be supporting the work of the negotiators. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. We support the new initiative to resume the flow of aid through pre-existing mechanisms in advance of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's mechanism becoming fully operational. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is an independent entity established to provide a secure mechanism for the delivery of aid directly to those in need. We call on the UN to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and Israel to reach agreements on how to operationalize this system in a way that works for all. One that provides the opportunity to deliver aid directly to civilians without diversion by Hamas and other terrorist and criminal groups. The United States will support a future for the people of Gaza that is free of Hamas and full of opportunity. As President Trump emphasized during his recent visit, before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts and tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together. The United States will do its part to help forge this new reality alongside Israel and our Arab partners. But at the same time, the United States stands with Israel in unequivocally rejecting any effort to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state or impose conditions on Israel which would be an unconscionable reward for the heinous Hamas attack on Israel that massacred and brutally kidnapped Israelis and Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag and Dr. Feroze Sidhwa for their statements. I want to seize this opportunity to express our support to Mr. Tom Fletcher for his briefing of last week on the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, on the morning of Friday, May 23rd, Dr. Ala al-Najjar left her home for her shift at the Nasser Hospital. She didn't know it will be the last time she said goodbye to 9 of her 10 children. This pediatrician, who had spent her life saving children's lives, became a grieving mother, forced to identify the calcinated remains, the calcinated bodies of her own sons and daughters. The body delivered to the emergency room by her colleagues in the very corridors where she once gave hope to others. Dr. Najjar's children had names. Yahya, Raqan, Raslan, Jubran, Eve, Rifan, Sidin, Luqman, and Sidra. All were killed. The eldest was 12-year-old. The youngest, just 6 months. These are these children. They were not members of a Center for Command and Control of Hamas. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, this is Dr. Najjar. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, her husband, Hamdi, is still lying in deep coma. And her 10-year son, Adam, critically wounded, is lying in the hospital. We hope he will be surviving. If Hamdi finally awakes, what will she tell him? And when Adam asks about his brothers and sisters, what story can she tell him? President, in another horrifying scene, young Warda Sheikh Khalil, a 6-year-old girl, tried to flee the flames. Tried to flee the flames. The flames engulfing her school, her shelter, after an Israeli airstrike. This shelter, meant to protect displaced civilians, became a crematory oven. Her mother and siblings were killed. Her father now clings to life. No one in Gaza is spared. Not doctors, not women, not children, and not the displaced. Not even hope itself. Mr. President, figures lost meaning. What is worth of saying 18,000 children dead? these are not only numbers. These are lives. These are dreams. These are voices, playtimes, lullabies. They were extinguished. They were the warmth of homes, the joy of classrooms. They were the pulse of neighborhood. The Israeli army killed them. They killed them deliberately in a mother's arms, in classrooms, in hospitals, in bread lines under staircases, and in tents. Their deaths were not collateral. They were the consequences of a system that sees Palestinian lives as not human, as disposable. There is no fading echo. It is a scream, and these horrors must end. The remaining survivors must be allowed to live. The world must see these children, the Palestinian children, the children of Gaza, as its own children. For Warda, for Ala, for the thousands, for the 18,000 who never got a chance to say goodbye, we must act. Mr. President, words of condemnation are no longer enough. We must act now. Since October the 7th, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more than 54,000 people. Yes, it's no more 53,000 people. Today, it's 54,000 people. Israel wounded more than 123,000 people. And since March 18 alone, more than 3,900 have been killed and over 11,000 wounded. How many more must die before action is taken by the Security Council? How many orphans must roam the ruins of Gaza? How much more blood must be spilled before this Council acknowledges that enough is enough? My country, Algeria, bears its responsibility and is determined to push the Council to act. The time for indecision is over. Mr. President, the Palestinian people were promised a sovereign state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital by the General Assembly, by this very Security Council, and by the international community. Yet, 3 decades after Oslo, the dream of a Palestinian state is vanishing under the boots of the Israeli occupation and the silence of the international community. The Israeli occupation persists, emboldened by impunity, by immunity. Settler violence surges. Settlement spreads. Palestinian land is swallowed inch by inch, and holy sites are desecrated while the world looks on. The global system means to uphold justice has become paralyzed. So we ask, what is expected of the Palestinians? Must they continue offering their children on the altar of global inaction? Does the international community still believe in a two-state solution? President, Palestinians, like all human beings, like all people, have the right to life, to dignity, to homeland. They are not an exception. We must resolve this conflict as its roots. Not just a lasting peace can exist. Not just and lasting peace can exist without the realization of the Palestinian people's right to an independent state. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, and I quote, "We must act decisively to end the ongoing historical injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We must urgently revive the peace process, which is currently facing an unprecedented deadlock. It is imperative to compel the occupying power to comply with the relevant United Nations resolutions and to adhere to its obligation. The solution is well known. It's time for its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Coordinator Kaag and Dr. Sidhwa for their important and thought-provoking briefings this morning. Mr. President, this Council has continuously discussed the immediate effect, devastating effect, of a number of concerning recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. In Gaza, we've discussed the disastrous humanitarian situation, more than 53,000 dead, over 100,000 injured, and the entire population on the brink of a man-made famine. As part of an overwhelming majority of voices in this Council, Denmark reiterates once again that humanitarian aid must flow freely and at scale into Gaza in line with international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. We have opposed an expanded Israeli military offensive, and we have called for an immediate end to the war, along with the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. In the West Bank, we've called for an end to settler violence and illegal settlements, which have recently accelerated an unprecedented speed. Yet, we continue to witness forced displacement, demolitions, and movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians. Mr. President, as we condemn the immediate effects of these developments, this Council has a responsibility to address their long-term impact on international peace and security. And let me make 3 points in this regard. First, the people of Gaza are starving. Starvation, especially for children, can cause irreversible harm that could impact the rest of their lives. The IPC warns that 71,000 children under 5 years old and 17,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are threatened by acute malnutrition. We stress the need for Israel to take immediate action to protect the human rights to life. All parties to the conflicts are bound to comply with international humanitarian law and the obligation to protect civilians, including Palestinian children, from harm. We also recall that the right to food is a fundamental human right. Second, the war in Gaza has caused major destruction of civilian infrastructure with devastating effects on children's education. More than 95% of all schools in Gaza have sustained damage. 660,000 children are pushed out of school and have lost as much as 19 months of education. In occupied East Jerusalem, another 800 students were forced out of their classrooms earlier this month after Israeli forces forced the closure of 6 UNRWA schools. Losing access to education risks leading to long-term consequences for children's well-being and learning. Education is critical for coping with trauma of war, and we just heard this morning Dr. Sidhwa assessing that half of Gaza's children are suicidal. And education is critical for building relevant skills needed to rebuild the country once the conflict is over. We reiterate that civilian infrastructure, including schools, must be protected, included by refraining from the use for military purposes. We call for Palestinian children's rights to safe education to be protected. Third, in the West Bank, Israel is taking control of record amount of Palestinian land, displacing Palestinians into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a contiguous and viable future Palestinian state. We recall that the EU has adopted sanctions against violent extremist settlers and encourage other Council members to do the same. Recently, we've also taken note of the Israeli government's disturbing decision to initiate land registration in Area C and register it to private Israelis. Denmark reiterates that any attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land would be unacceptable and violate international law. Mr. President, in Israel, Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks have caused extreme and lasting trauma and has pushed Israelis and Palestinians further apart. We continue to condemn the brutal terrorist attack and the ruthless hostage-taking by Hamas, and we reiterate our demand that all hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Taken together, these developments do nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. However, this cannot come at the cost of the civilian Palestinian people and their right to live in peace and dignity. I therefore reiterate Denmark's urgent calls to Israel to halt the ongoing and intensified military offensive and immediately allow for the full resumption of humanitarian aid. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations must be allowed to work independently and impartially to save innocent lives now. We can neither ignore the devastating immediate effects of the current developments nor their long-term impact on future generations of Palestinians and the viability of the two-state solution. Denmark maintains that the two-state solution is the only viable path to achieve permanent peace and stability in the Middle East. We look forward to the upcoming conference on the implementation of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Denmark for her statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Slovenia. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to thank Special Coordinator Kaag for her briefing today and for asks. I also want to thank Dr. Sidhwa for his testimony and for his work in Gaza. Mr. President, many times we have said we are lost for words, but we cannot repeat these phrases over and over again. Early on during our council term, I instructed my team to avoid lengthy explanations of the situation on the ground in our statements. This is for the briefers, who usually on a weekly basis or even more often inform us about the state of affairs. And here at the UN and in the Security Council, I think we are very lucky. We are very privileged. We are honored to have the best briefers on the situation on the ground. From Special Coordinator Kaag to Undersecretary General Fletcher to civil society briefers like Dr. Sidhwa today. Our role is not to challenge the briefers, is not to challenge the messages, but to address the message. Our role is to take positions, to be the one who takes into account briefings, the one who can carefully examine the positions of the others and find possibilities for the Council to react to threats of international peace and security. Mr. President, my statement can be summarized in one word and one sentence. The word is responsibility. And the statement is, we have responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Burning tents, striking schools and shelters, continuously displaying civilians, causing hunger, shutting down hospitals, cutting essential services. These grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law have pushed thousands of civilians to the brink of survival. As the task of listing every single cruelty has become impossible, our responsibility not to remain silent has become clearer, and the responsibility to act. We have a clear responsibility to protect civilians. With the alarm bells ringing through the latest IPC report and the information circulating on the hunger in Gaza, we continue calling for immediate lifting of the blockade on Gaza. As the full blockade surpasses 2 months, we must be clear that the current volume of aid reaching Gaza is not enough, and that entry at scale and safe and unhidden distribution are urgently needed. Crossings need to be open. All possible corridors used and facilitation must be granted. Safe passage for medical personnel and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Time is of the essence. We repeat that any actor delivering humanitarian assistance must adhere to international humanitarian law and international principles on humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We repeat our deep concerns over the new model of distribution of aid. We welcome the UN coordinated plan to resume humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza, and as clearly underlined in today's statement by the EU High Representative Kallas, we recall the indispensable role of the UN in distributing humanitarian assistance. During the ceasefire, the UN proved that it can deliver if allowed. Mr. President, we have a clear responsibility to act. This is why Slovenia fully supports the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to find a negotiated solution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on all parties to engage in good faith. This is why Slovenia strongly supports the conference on the two-state solution to be held in June under chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia. But we do believe these efforts should be done hand in hand with the action of the Security Council. Time is of the essence. The Council should be clear in its unambiguous demand for unimpeded humanitarian access
and that is why we support urgent action of the Council. We hope the Council will show unity when voting on a humanitarian resolution that is now being discussed among the elected members. Mr. President, remaining silent is not an option. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, France thanks the Special Coordinator, Madam Sigrid Kaag, as well as Dr. Feroze Sidhwa, for their briefings, which serve as a reminder of the ordeal being endured by civilians in Gaza. Mr. President, France will never forget the heinous terrorist crimes perpetrated on 7 October 2023, the hostages who remain in Gaza in the hands of Hamas and other terrorist groups must be released. And the minister has reiterated the fact that Hamas is not and cannot be a part of the solution in Gaza. Hamas needs to be disarmed and must be politically neutralized. However, the civilians in Gaza are not Hamas, and civilians in Gaza are enduring a humanitarian situation that is devastating. And the Security Council has an obligation to act in response by continuing to demand that Israel meet its obligations under international humanitarian law, and the Security Council must act and adopt a humanitarian resolution. Firstly, all obstacles to the entry and delivery of humanitarian assistance and all restrictions on the quantity and composition of this assistance need to be lifted. The highly limited quantities of recent days are insufficient when it comes to meeting the needs of the populations, especially after 12 long weeks of total blockade. The images of desperate, starving people throwing themselves on trucks and aid distribution points are a tragic illustration of this. Dozens of tons of assistance financed by France and other countries not being delivered to Gaza is unacceptable. Second, we reiterate our full support for the United Nations and humanitarian partners thereof, who have demonstrated their ability to deliver assistance fully in line with humanitarian principles. We applaud the plan that was announced on 16 May, which shores up safeguards against the risks of a diversion, and we call in this regard upon Israel to facilitate and to allow for full access of UN personnel to Gaza in order to verify the delivery of humanitarian assistance as stipulated in Resolution 2720. We recall our support for UNRWA, the Undersecretary General Fletcher, and his services, and we support all UN agencies, funds, and programs, as well as systems who are working on the ground seeking to provide honest, impartial testimony and to deliver on humanitarian needs. We call upon Israel to allow the United Nations and humanitarian partners to operate in full safety and security, the establishment of an alternative system which respects neither international law nor humanitarian principles thereof, and which engenders forced displacements of people is simply unacceptable. Yesterday was a stark illustration of the limitations of the mechanism that Israel has established. Moreover, France recalls its firm opposition to any permanent occupation plan by Israel for the Gaza Strip and the forced displacement of people. These grave violations of international law are leading to a complete impasse. Moreover, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is part and parcel of Israel's obligations under the Geneva Conventions. Recurrent strikes targeting schools, hospitals, homes are unacceptable and must end. Mr. President, there is an urgent need for Israel to cease its military operations, for a permanent ceasefire to be established in Gaza. We call upon the parties to revert back to full respect with the ceasefire, and we applaud the efforts undertaken by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt as they endeavor to facilitate negotiations. I wish to reiterate the following. We stand in solidarity with all the families of all of the hostages who need to be released without delay. We reaffirm the right of Israelis to live in safety and security. We condemn the recent Houthi attacks. However, there's an urgent need to propose an alternative to war for Palestinians and Israelis, an alternative rooted in the two-state solution, one that reflects the legitimate aspirations of the two peoples, Palestinians and Israelis, to have a state and to live in peace and security. France thanks member states for their mobilization during the preparatory meeting on the 23rd of May, specifically those who have accepted responsibility of the working group. There's a need now to adopt concrete political, financial, material commitments to preserve the two-state solution with a view to the convening of the conference, which France will co-chair with Saudi Arabia on the 17th to the 20th of June 2025. This is an international conference which will be convened at the request of the General Assembly to support the two-state solution here in New York. The foreign minister recalled that France wishes to see this conference resulting in meaningful progress on peace, security for Israel and Palestine, the recognition of Palestine as a state, normalization and regional integration, disarmament of Hamas, and the restoration of Palestinian governance. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of France for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening today's meeting. I also thank Special Coordinator Kaag for her comprehensive briefing, and I have also listened carefully to the moving testimony of Dr. Sidhwa. Mr. President, about 2 weeks ago, we received a sobering briefing from USG Tom Fletcher as he appealed to us to seriously examine the legacy of this council, or the legacy this council would leave in relation to what is currently taking place in Gaza. Today, we have again heard a similar appeal from Special Coordinator Kaag and Dr. Sidhwa, even as the situation continues to worsen in unimaginable ways. No one should be made to live under the horrific circumstances that Palestinians in Gaza have been experiencing since 7th of October. This council must take principled and urgent action in response to the grave situation that has been foisted on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, as efforts continue for achieving a return to the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, Guyana is of the view that any peace deal reached should have at least 3 guarantees. First, Palestinians should not be forced to give up any of their rights in exchange for peace. Specifically, they should not be forced to forfeit their homeland. A choice between continuation of the Israeli offensive and forced displacement is a false choice. Second, any peace deal should comply scrupulously with international law. The war in Gaza has set, or seen attempts to set, precedents that are plain violations of international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Recall, for example, restrictions imposed on the United Nations and humanitarian workers. The Knesset legislation against UNRWA is a case in point. Recall also Israel's ongoing aid blockade and its proposed mechanism for aid delivery under the control of its military. Third, the protection and well-being of civilians should remain the chief consideration of any peace deal. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen in unimaginable ways, as described by Special Coordinator. We are especially concerned by the escalating strikes on tents, residential buildings, schools, and crowded hospitals, and the methodical destruction of entire neighborhoods. The constant evacuation orders and the militarization of the majority of the Gaza Strip are equally concerning. There is nothing that can justify this level of violence against civilians, among whom are children, including babies. The aid blockade, which was imposed on 2nd March, seriously crippled the humanitarian efforts that were facilitated by the ceasefire deal. While noting the recent lifting of some restrictions by Israeli officials, we simultaneously noted that certain measures are severely limiting humanitarians' ability to take advantage of this small respite. We noted, for example, the challenges created by insecurity, delays in coordination approvals, and inappropriate routes being provided by Israeli forces that are not viable for the movement of cargo. These are all man-made obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its international legal obligations regarding access to essential goods and services by the civilian population of Gaza. The provision of aid must be governed by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Guyana expresses its confidence once again in the ability of the United Nations and its partners to deliver aid at the required scale throughout Gaza, if given the relevant facility by the occupying power. The UN has consistently demonstrated its readiness every time there has been an opportunity to get aid into Gaza. The state of food insecurity in Gaza is also extremely worrying, with many Palestinians experiencing what they described as a slow death sentence. The testimony of humanitarians in Gaza that, and I quote, Palestinians prefer to die by an airstrike than to go through the suffering of a lack of food and lie to their children about their next meal, end of quote, is an indictment on those who have created these types of choices for innocent civilians. Mr. President, colleagues, it has not escaped us that while negotiations, which we welcome, are ongoing to reach a nuclear deal with the objective of avoiding the potential destruction of another country, different weapons are being employed against the Palestinian people, resulting in their destruction. Regrettably, we are not responding meaningfully to counter the actions of the Israeli Defense Force. What makes this even more concerning is the fact that the visuals of the decimation of Palestinians are live streamed across the globe, yet we are not acting to stop it. The judgment of future generations will be justifiably harsh towards us. We who saw the attempts at obliterating an entire people, but did not act. This Council has the opportunity to act now. Enough is enough. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, Guyana is compelled to reiterate the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, in accordance with Resolution 2735. Nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and it is clear that the military objectives set by Israel cannot be met without severe consequences for civilians. Second, Guyana reiterates its call for the release of all hostages being held in Gaza, as well as all Palestinians detained by Israel without charge. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and all perpetrators must be held accountable. Third, Guyana appeals to Israel to completely lift the humanitarian aid blockade on Gaza and to allow the United Nations and its partners to carry out their life-saving work. International humanitarian law demands that Israel fulfill its obligations towards civilians, and the International Court of Justice has reaffirmed this. Finally, Guyana appeals to this Council and the international community as a whole to work urgently to revitalize the two-state solution as the only just and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Presidency for convening this timely meeting in light of the deepening humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories. We thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefings and for her efforts as the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. We also thank Dr. Feroze Sidhwa for his briefings. We remain gravely alarmed by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the continued military escalation has pushed the population to the edge of survival. There is quite simply no safe place to go in Gaza for civilians. The recent reports of famine risk, forced displacement, and destruction of vital infrastructures are deeply distressing. This is a crisis entirely man-made and preventable, which is exacerbated by the persistent denial of access to a life-saving aid. Somalia strongly condemns the ongoing restrictions on humanitarian access and calls for an immediate, safe, unhindered delivery for the assistance throughout Gaza. All border crossings, including Rafah and Karim Shalom, must be reopened, and international humanitarian law must be respected without exceptions. We also express our concern regarding the mounting pressure on UNRWA and reiterate our full support for its critical role in serving the Palestinian refugees. Attempts to legitimize or defund the agency threatens not only the rights of the refugees, but also the broader stability of the region. We are further troubled by the continuous settlement activity and settlement violence against civilians in West Bank and the erosion of the legal and historical status quo of the Jerusalem. The right of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination, return to their homeland and statehood, are not subject to negotiation or delay. Mr. President, the blatant disregard for binding decisions of International Court of Justice, including the provisional measures issued in January and March of this year, is a direct challenge to the international legal order. Israel, as occupying power, bears legal responsibility under the international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. These obligations are not optional. They are binding, and they must be enforced. Attacks on civilians and obstruction of humanitarian aid, targeting a medical facility, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war all demand independent investigation and credible justice redress. The consequences of this prolonged conflict are not limited to Gaza. The crisis has triggered widespread regional instability, increasing tensions across the Middle East. The situation risks spiraling into a broader confrontation with a serious implication for the international peace and security. Mr. President, this Council cannot remain silent as innocent lives are lost and humanitarian norms are violated. We call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, the full restoration of humanitarian access across Gaza. Somalia supports all credible diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalation and the conflict resolution, including the upcoming International Peace Conference, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. We urge the international community to seize this moment and relaunch a serious political process toward a just, lasting peace, one that guarantees the establishment of independent and sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif at its capital, in line with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its commitment to working alongside fellow Council members and regional partners to uphold international law, defend humanitarian principles, and advance the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Kaag and Dr. Sidhwa for their briefings today, which painted a catastrophic picture. Let me pay tribute to you and to your humanitarian and health worker colleagues working tirelessly to alleviate this suffering. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK has always supported Israel's right to defend itself. It suffered a heinous attack by Hamas on 7 October, and hostages have been through an unimaginable ordeal. We reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release and accountability for those responsible. But as my Prime Minister has said, we strongly oppose the Israeli government's escalating military action in Gaza, which is wholly disproportionate. An immediate ceasefire, not more bloodshed, is the way to secure the release of the hostages and stop the endless cycle of violence. Second, as we have heard again today, the level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Civilians face starvation, displacement, and trauma. The UN warned of the risks from the Israeli government's plan for aid delivery. In Rafah yesterday, we saw this warning become a reality. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation lost control of its distribution center, with multiple casualties reported and great distress for those desperately seeking aid. In contrast, the UN has a clear plan to deliver life-saving aid at scale. It contains robust mitigations against aid diversion. Brave humanitarians stand ready to do their jobs. 9,000 trucks wait at the border. Our message to Prime Minister Netanyahu is clear. Let aid in and enable the UN to operate now. We reiterate our support for the UN, OCHA, and all its aid agencies. We also reject the Israeli government's unacceptable intention to take control of the Gaza Strip. Permanent forced displacement is a breach of international humanitarian law. Third, President, in the West Bank, violent settlers continue to assault and abuse Palestinians, forcing entire communities to flee. In Jerusalem, provocative visits to holy sites and inflammatory language by Israeli ministers are adding to the tensions. On 20 May, the UK announced further sanctions on individuals and entities promoting violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. We will continue to act against those committing these abuses. President, the UK will not give up on the two-state solution. We will continue to work closely with France, Saudi Arabia, and all our partners towards a successful conference in June, which moves us towards this goal. Finally, let me finish by condemning the horrific murders of Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Milgrim in Washington, D.C. last week, and offering condolences to their families and to their colleagues. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Panama would like to thank you for convening this meeting, and we'd like to thank Madam Sigrid Kaag, Interim Special Coordinator for the Peace Process in the Middle East, and Dr. Sidhwa Feroze. Thank them both for their briefings. And we recognize the representatives of Israel and the United Arab Emirates and the observer state of Palestine, who honor us with their participation in this meeting. And we thank the briefers for the dramatic details they shared with us. Panama is very concerned about the testimony and images that bear witness every day to the fact that Gaza and the West Bank are going through a humanitarian catastrophe of devastating proportions. We reiterate our urgent call for a restoration of an immediate ceasefire that will facilitate safe access for vital humanitarian assistance and the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all the hostages. President, the 7th of October 2023 was a turning point. On that day, which should have been like any other day, this became a nightmare for hundreds of Israeli families with far-reaching consequences. The attacks on the Israeli kibbutzes, the cities, the Nova Music Festival where 1,200 innocent Israeli civilians were present, very many of them young people. They were despicably murdered with premeditation and unjustifiable intentional cruelty on Israeli territory. These people were murdered and another 251 kidnapped and taken to dark tunnels in Gaza. This was the outcome of the massacre. People who were plucked from their homes and the environment that gave them security. The terror burst into their lives without distinction, leaving behind a still open wound. We'd also like to highlight the silent drama of those that have disappeared. There are still Israeli hostages whose fate is uncertain, as well as very many Palestinians still under the rubble, where there's no clear information about their whereabouts. For some people, the uncertainty with regard to disappearance prevents them from receiving closure in the grieving process. We reiterate our support and solidarity with all the families. The horror unleashed on the 7th of October was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a spiral of violence that still hasn't stopped, and it is civilians who have suffered the most. Since then, the Palestinian population has also been living under a constant threat, trapped in the crossfire and the consequences of political and military decisions which ignore human dignity. The skies over Gaza no longer bring hope, but instead the roar of bombs. This same sky, which our sons and daughters, nieces and nephews look upon with amazement and joy when they see a kite flying or they see a bird flying overhead, for millions of people, this sky has become an alarm, a warning that death lies in wait and it can arrive at any time. And on land where previously there were schools, where children had dignified homes, where there was a freshly baked bread, now there's only hunger, rubble, and the imposing shadow of a war tank. What should have been their happiest years has now become a wasteland of sirens, explosions, and constant threat, generating fears that no person, irrespective of their age, should experience. More than 53,000 Palestinians have died, and hundreds of thousands have been wounded during the conflict. More than 1.9 million people have been displaced in Gaza, some of them more than 10 times. 81% of the territory has been declared a militarized zone or subject to displacement orders. In the West Bank, the restrictions on movement, demolitions, and violence have worsened a situation that was already unsustainable. President, the situation for children in Gaza is particularly alarming. UNICEF has warned us that more than 70,000 children under 5 years of age could suffer from acute malnutrition, including 14,000 with severe malnutrition. Very many of these children are dying due to completely preventable causes. We're concerned at the virtual total collapse of essential services. According to the World Health Organization, only 19 of 36 hospitals in the Strip are still operational, and at least approximately 94% of those are out of commission, damaged or destroyed either partially or totally. Kamal Adwan Hospital, a center that dealt with severe malnutrition in the north of Gaza, suspended its operations on the 20th of May. Throughout the territory, there are only 2,000 hospital beds left for more than 2 million people. According to the United Nations, the community kitchens are only able to distribute 300,000 rations per day when what is required are more than 2 million. Limited and fragmented access to basic necessities, food, medicines, drinking water, cannot continue to be the norm. We very concerned to take note of the incidents that occurred yesterday when the chaos caused by a despairing Palestinian population who were hungry overcame a distribution center. These facts demonstrate the limitations of this solution and underscore the urgent need for there to be better coordination with the participation of the United Nations agencies that will guarantee safe access and more effective and broad distribution of humanitarian assistance. All humanitarian efforts should be led by the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence in order to guarantee that aid reaches those that need it the most without interference or any conditions being imposed. Panama expresses its tribute to and thanks to humanitarian workers of the United Nations and others who, in the midst of this horror, continue to provide assistance with bravery. Their work is a flicker of hope in the midst of suffering. Mr. President, Panama reiterates its urgent call for an end to be put to the spiral of suffering of Israelis and Palestinians. The time has come to save lives, to allow unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance, and to bring about the dignified, immediate, and unconditional release of those who still remain in captivity. We are not just speaking about a cessation of hostilities, but rather a moral awakening, a restoration of the basic notion that every human life matters. The future of Gaza cannot continue to be held hostage to the extremism of Hamas and by its express intention to terrorize the Israeli people and keep them hostage to their threats. The future of Palestine and Israel cannot continue to be hostage to fear, hate, and despair. Only political courage, compassion, and a genuine will for reconciliation and efforts for a comprehensive reconstruction will be able to open the path towards lasting peace, where Israelis and Palestinians are able to live side by side in peace with secure, recognized, and mutually respected borders. Peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of dignity. Thank you very much.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Panama for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process ad interim, for a detailed and sobering briefing on the situation in the Middle East, particularly with reference to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I also acknowledge the compelling contribution of Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. Mr. President, while Sierra Leone acknowledges the fragile but incremental progress in Syria and Lebanon, the unfolding catastrophe in Gaza and the persistent violence in the West Bank remain matters of grave and urgent concern. The past months have witnessed one of the darkest moments for civilians in Gaza. The persistent obstruction of life-saving humanitarian aid, systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, and widespread loss of innocent life have breached not only the bounds of humanitarian concern, but also raised serious questions of accountability under international law. The prolonged blockade and the military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces have rendered over 80% of the territory either under evacuation orders or de facto inaccessible. These actions have created catastrophic conditions that imperil the survival of the civilian population and heighten the risk of starvation, malnutrition, and lawlessness. The month of May alone have seen hospitals, such as the Indonesia and European facilities in Gaza, struck by attacks, further diminishing access to urgent care. The repeated targeting of healthcare infrastructure and personnel is a clear violation of international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Civilian objects must never be used for military purposes, nor civilians used as human shields. The protection of civilian lives must remain a cardinal principle for all parties to the conflict. In the West Bank, the upsurge in settler violence, forced displacement, and destruction of property, particularly in Tulkarem, Jenin, and Tobas, is deeply concerning. We deplore all such acts, including the killing of civilians by any actor. Mr. President, the toll on civilians in Gaza, especially women and children, continues to shock the global conscience. Sierra Leone stands firm in its commitment to the UN Charter and to the fundamental principles of peace, justice, and human dignity. Accordingly, we must collectively recognize that the situation unfolding in Gaza now bears many of the hallmarks of mass atrocity crimes. The risk is not theoretical. It is real, credible, and escalating. Given our experience, we understand too well the consequences of delayed international action or inaction. We also recall with painful clarity the global failure to prevent the mass atrocities in Rwanda and Srebrenica, subsequently declared as genocide by competent international courts. The International Court of Justice, in its landmark decisions, has underscored the legal and moral duty to act to prevent genocide. The obligation to prevent genocide is not discretionary. It is a preemptory norm of international law, binding on all states. It imposes duty not only to refrain from committing such crimes, but to take active, timely measures to avert them. Presently, we face a moment no less consequential. We are deeply alarmed by the consistent report of indiscriminate bombardment, destruction of vital infrastructure, deprivation of humanitarian assistance, and inflammatory rhetoric. These patterns may contribute to creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group in whole or in part, which is explicitly prohibited under the Genocide Convention, which codifies customary international law. We therefore call for the immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access and for urgent international action to forestall further deterioration of the situation. The closure of crossings and the obstruction of aid are unacceptable and must be reversed without delay. The complicity of the international community must not be repeated. Further, the provision of humanitarian aid must be fully aligned with the established humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles are not only foundational to the effectiveness of aid delivery, but essential to ensuring that assistance reaches those in greatest need. Aid must never be instrumentalized as a tool of war or subjected to conditionalities that compromise the dignity or survival of affected populations. The integrity of humanitarian operations must be protected at all times, and all parties must allow for safe, timely, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors in accordance with IHL. Mr. President, in January 2024, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures in the case South Africa versus Israel, directing the State of Israel to take all necessary steps to prevent acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention. On 24 May 2024, these measures were expanded to include halting the military offensive in Rafah and allowing humanitarian access. Sierra Leone underscores that these orders are binding. Compliance is not a matter of political discretion, but a legal imperative. Failure to do so threatens the legitimacy of the International Court of Justice and undermines the credibility of the rules-based international system. Colleagues, at the core of the current catastrophe lies a crisis of accountability. The scale of suffering endured by civilians in Gaza and in the state of Israel must not go unaddressed. Perpetrators of grave violation of international law must be held responsible. Sierra Leone believes that upholding international law is indispensable to restoring justice and preventing further atrocities. This Council, therefore, cannot remain silent. The Council must act with the clarity and conviction that this moment demands. The credibility of the Council and the lives of the thousands of civilians depend on it. Sierra Leone urges a renewed commitment to this Council's charter responsibilities, particularly in preventing atrocity crimes and upholding international humanitarian law. In the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda and in the Pact for the Future, calls have been made for a more predictable and principled approach to early warning, prevention, and accountability. These frameworks must be operationalized through consistent Council engagement and action, including through veto restraint initiatives, particularly in contexts where the risk of mass atrocity is acute. Mr. President, as we call for urgent action on mass atrocity risk, Sierra Leone affirms that only a political solution can bring sustainable peace. We reiterate our support for the two-state solution, with an independent state of Palestine living side by side with the state of Israel in peace and security. While humanitarian actions are vital, they are no substitute for a sustainable diplomatic process. Ceasefire, release of hostages, and the lifting of humanitarian blockades must be the starting point. We commend the diplomatic efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, and urge for continued mediation. We call on the parties to act with urgency and in good faith. Sierra Leone believes that unless the root causes of occupation, settlement expansion, and political exclusion are addressed, durable peace will remain elusive. We affirm our full support for a negotiated, just, and lasting political solution, grounded in international law and the relevant UN resolutions. This conflict has inflicted immense suffering, claimed countless lives, and seen too many missed opportunities for peace. The collapse of the ceasefire in March alone resulted in over 3,500 additional civilian deaths, with more than 50 hostages still held in captivity. The international community bears a collective responsibility not only to halt the mayhem, but to foster the conditions for lasting coexistence and peace. We therefore conclude by urging this Security Council to act. We also urge the Council to ensure full respect for international law, accountability for all serious violations, and protection for all civilians, regardless of identity. Let us not allow this moment to pass with inaction or equivocation. The credibility of this Council and the lives of thousands depend on what we choose to do now. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process ad interim Sigrid Kaag for the briefing on the situation in Gaza, as well as Dr. Sidhwa for his testimony. We wish to take this opportunity to extend our solidarity with the humanitarian coordinator, Tom Fletcher, in connection with the attacks that targeted him after his latest briefing at the Security Council of the United Nations. Mr. President, every new day brings with it tragic news from the Palestine-Israel conflict zone. News headlines are broadcasting the horrific shattering of new records. The number of dead children and women, journalists, humanitarian workers is staggering. Strikes targeting schools and hospitals are no longer shocking to anybody. They have long ago become the living nightmare of the residents of the Gaza Strip, and one can only guess at the conditions being endured in Gaza by those who stand ready to selflessly fulfill their humanitarian duty before the Palestinian people. Despite this, the hope for the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the conflict and the restoration of the January deal, which has been kindled by reports about the intense efforts undertaken by mediators, this hope was still alive. However, this hope was not fated to come to pass. On 16 May, Israel launched the Gideon's Chariots operation, which has further exacerbated the suffering endured by peaceful Palestinian civilians. The biblical name belies the brutal aim of this operation, that is control over all of Gaza, the cleansing of the north of the enclave, of the north of the strip from its residents, and their forcible displacements to the south. Already today, the IDF controls 77% of the territory of the Gaza Strip. With the resumption of hostilities in March, nearly 4,000 Palestinians have been killed, and since October 2023, nearly 54,000 people have been killed, 123,000 have been wounded. The military operation has in no way yet helped to resolve the issue of the hostages. The only hostage who was released recently, the U.S.-Israeli citizen Idan Alexander, was handed over by Hamas representatives as a gesture of goodwill. Another 33 hostages were able to return to their homes and reunite with their loved ones as a result of a deal which was reached in January. And the fates of the other hostages against the backdrop of the active military operations in the Strip remains uncertain. Mr. President, the untold suffering endured by the Palestinian population and the remaining hostages is the result of the humanitarian blockade of Gaza, which Israel imposed on 2 March. Despite the sporadic weakening by the Israeli side of the blockade, as a result of which last week permission was granted for the entry of 400 trucks with assistance, despite that, the blockade has effectively been ongoing. Assistance which is permitted to enter is merely a drop in the bucket against the backdrop of the staggering needs. Let us recall, even before the blockade, in order to meet and address the humanitarian situation in the Strip, there was a need to bring in, at the minimum, 600 trucks every day. Today, the situation is far more catastrophic. Food supplies are dwindling. Most medicines and medical supplies have been depleted, and there's an acute shortage of fuel in order to provide for operations of basic infrastructure. People are desperate. We have seen what happened at the assistance distribution point, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation point. The humanitarian structures working on the ground unanimously proclaimed their readiness and have been proclaiming their readiness and, most importantly, their ability to provide the Gazan people with all basic goods and services as soon as Israel lifts the blockade and removes any and all obstacles for the delivery and distribution of humanitarian assistance, which the UN Secretariat and the majority of the membership of the Council, including the Russian Federation, categorically condemn. Israel's proposed plan flies in the face of humanitarian principles. This plan disregards the needs of certain categories of citizens, including those residing in remote regions, and on the whole, this jeopardizes the lives of both Palestinians and humanitarian workers. We are equally concerned by the ongoing IDF Iron Wall operation in the West Bank of the Jordan River, as well as clashes between Israeli troops, settlers, and local civilians. Military operations are engulfing Burkin, Jenin, Tulkarm, Husan, as well as Nablus's and Hebron's environs. Israelis are simultaneously demolishing Palestinian property and carrying out mass arrests of Palestinian civilians. Just recently, at least 40 Palestinians have been detained. Interreligious hatred is being fomented by Israeli leadership's provocative actions, including visits to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound by approximately 1,500 radical right-wing Israelis who were accompanied by the Minister of National Security of Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Attempts by Western Jerusalem to violate the legal and historical status quo of the holy city's sacred site are illegal and unacceptable. Mr. President, today we are observing a clash of two realities with growing distance between them. On the one hand, there are loud calls for from the international community for there to be respect for international humanitarian law, a ceasefire, the release of detained persons, and the implementation of the two-state solution. On the other hand, Israel's singular focus on achieving all political objectives through military means alone. They have no scruples about selecting their means and no qualms about loss of civilians until Gaza is completely razed to the ground. In this reality, there is room only for war and Old Testament brutality. What can we do to align the reality on the ground and the aspirations of the august bodies of the United Nations? For that, the international community needs to undertake meaningful efforts to facilitate the resolution to the root cause of the protracted conflict, the fact that the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to establish their own independent state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel, has not been upheld. This will become possible only following the immediate return to the peace process on the universally recognized international legal basis, at the heart of which was and remains the cornerstone 2 states for 2 peoples principle. As the most urgent step to that end, the UN Security Council should send a clear message to the parties about the unconditional cessation of hostilities and to achieve the lifting by Israel of the humanitarian blockade. And this would create favorable conditions for the release of the remaining hostages and detainees. And this would facilitate the resumption of the peace process for Palestinian-Israeli settlement. The tragedy that is occurring before our very eyes in Gaza is, among other things, the consequence of insufficient resolve on the part of the international community to ensure the enforcement of their own resolutions on the establishment of 2 states, Israel and Palestine. Despite the exceedingly difficult context, reciprocal recriminations, and emotions running high, we believe that we need to achieve having these 2 peoples surmount decades of hostility and to achieve peace, stability, and prosperity for the entire Middle East region. Any other scenarios harbor grave risks, not just for the region, but for all of humankind. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also begin by thanking Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing today. And we are also grateful to Dr. Feroze Sidhwa for his sobering remarks. Those were harrowing details, unimaginable, so difficult to listen to and grasp. And one would shudder to think how all those on ground, all those women and children and doctors and humanitarian workers would be coping with that situation on a daily basis. Mr. President, my delegation would also at the outset recall and reaffirm its complete support to the briefings, the objective and truthful and responsible statements by senior UN officials, including USG Tom Fletcher, before this Council. In our view, any undue criticism of their work must be unacceptable. Mr. President, we meet yet again under the shadow of a deepening yet preventable tragedy in Gaza, one that tests not only our conscience, but the very credibility of this Council. This is not a natural disaster. It is a man-made catastrophe. As we heard from both briefers today and many other Council members, this is a man-made catastrophe driven by Israel, the occupying powers' unrelenting, illegal blockade of Gaza, and the callous bombardment and deliberate killings carried out with full impunity. The numbers are staggering. More than 54,000 Palestinians have been killed, majority of them children and women. Over 122,000 have been injured. Gaza's people face continuous indiscriminate assault from land, air, and sea. The psychological and societal trauma is beyond measure, beyond imagination. This is without question one of the gravest humanitarian crises of our times. Mr. President, how many more atrocities must be committed before this Council does what is right, morally, legally, and under the UN Charter? Words of concern are no longer enough. The time to act, the time to prevent genocide is now. As Dr. Sidhwa said, we must not allow these atrocities to be normalized, for that would be an affront to international law and human dignity. To grasp the scale of this catastrophe, let me highlight 4 urgent dimensions of the suffering in Gaza. First, the health and medical system has collapsed. It has, in fact, been systematically destroyed and dismantled. Hospitals are overwhelmed, operating without fuel, without sanitation, without essential supplies. More than 800 health facilities and assets have been attacked. Medical workers have been killed, ambulances destroyed. This is the systematic erasure of the right to health and to life. Second, famine is no longer a threat. It is here. In Gaza, at least 57 children have already died of hunger. 1 in 5 Gazans could face starvation. Humanitarian convoys are being blocked or attacked. Relief workers are being targeted. Starvation is being weaponized flagrantly and illegally. Third, Gaza's civilian infrastructure lies in ruins. Water systems are destroyed. Electricity is cut. Communications are blacked out. More than 80% of homes have been destroyed. Most of Gaza now lies within a militarized zone. This is not collateral damage. It is deliberate, orchestrated destruction designed to break the will of the Palestinian people to survive. Fourth, the toll on women and children is unspeakable. According to UN Women, over 28,000 women and girls have been killed, 1 every hour since October. 50,000 women are pregnant. Next month, more than 5,000 will give birth, many in tents, on the streets, without electricity, clean water, or medical care. And while Gaza is being decimated, the West Bank remains under siege. Displacement is rising. Movement is restricted. Violence by settlers continues unchecked. In just the past 4 months, Israeli occupying forces have killed more than 130 Palestinians. Homes are being demolished. Arbitrary arrests continue. We also strongly condemned the provocative visits by Israeli officials to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, violations of the legal and historical status quo. These inflammatory actions threaten to ignite wider regional tensions. The sanctity of Al-Aqsa must be upheld in line with international law and UN resolutions. Mr. President, against this grim background, we call for 4 urgent steps. First, an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. Resolution 2735 must be implemented in full. All attacks on civilians must end. We support all continuing efforts to restore the ceasefire. Second, the full and immediate lifting of the Gaza blockade. Humanitarian teams must operate safely and without obstruction. The current trickle of aid is wholly inadequate and unjustifiable. This Council must demand immediate and unconditional removal of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza and its safe and unhindered distribution at scale, including by the UN and humanitarian partners, including UNRWA, throughout Gaza Strip, in full compliance with international humanitarian law. Third, any forced displacement of the Palestinians from the Palestinian land must be strongly rejected. Fourth, we must address the root cause, the prolonged occupation and denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination and statehood. A just peace demands a two-state solution based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as the capital of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. The conference next month, to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, offers a unique opportunity to move concretely and irreversibly in that direction, an objective that is clearly supported by the overwhelming majority of the international community. Mr. President, while that action will take place in the General Assembly, this Council cannot remain a bystander. It must act in accordance with its mandate to protect civilians under siege, to uphold international law, and to speak and to be on the side of the oppressed. The time for equivocation is over. There is no justification whatsoever for the human suffering of the Palestinian people. Yes, we agree, enough is enough. The cries from Gaza cannot continue to be met with silence. The world cannot afford another day of inaction. History will surely not absolve us of our responsibility. Mr. President, the sense around the table is clear. The urgent asks are so evident. Ceasefire, release of hostages, humanitarian action, and protection of innocent civilians. All of this is doable. We call on all Council members to come together, to act through a resolution, to promote this objective in the immediate term, and to help create an environment conducive for the June conference and ultimately towards a just and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Pakistan for his statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank the Special Coordinator at Interim Kaag and Dr. Sidhwa for their briefings. Since May the 16th, Israel has continued to intensify its military offensive in Gaza, which has completely destroyed large, densely populated areas and caused the death of more than 1,000 Gazans in the past 2 weeks alone. The question is repeatedly asked, when will this conflict end? Over the past 600 days, northern, central, and southern Gaza have been ravaged by war, claiming the lives of more than 54,000 people. The population of Gaza has been forcibly displaced time and again. The Security Council and the GA have adopted multiple resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire, but the conflict has not yet subsided, and the engine of war is still roaring. Continued prolongation of the fighting will not lead to the release of hostages, but only to more death and hatred. The question has been repeatedly asked, are there no limits to the means of this conflict? Even wars have rules. Compliance with international humanitarian law is an undeniable obligation of all parties. In Gaza, however, we have witnessed the red lines of the international law and the bottom line of human morality repeatedly violated and breached. Humanitarian assistance has been weaponized, with 2 million people plunged into extreme hunger as a result of the prolonged blockade. Schools, hospitals, refugee camps, and UN facilities have been targeted. Journalists and humanitarian workers have been mercilessly killed. Securing humanitarian assistance is an obligation of the occupying power under international law. All assistance must adhere to the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Safety of civilian facilities and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. All attacks must be strictly investigated and perpetrators held accountable. People were again asking the question, are the Palestinian people to be forced to lose their homes once again? Gaza is in ruins, with living conditions severely jeopardized. Recently, there have been repeated calls from the Israeli side for completely destroying and taking over of all of Gaza. The Israeli army already controls more than 70% of Gaza. At the same time, continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank and intensified settler violence gravely limits the space for the Palestinian people to survive. Changing the demographic and territorial composition of Gaza, as well as settlement activities, are in violation of the Security Council resolutions and international law. The annexation of Gaza and the West Bank will completely take away the prospects for peace in the Middle East. In the face of such questions, China firmly reiterates that a durable ceasefire in Gaza cannot be delayed, and that Israel must immediately cease all military operations. Alleviating the humanitarian catastrophe is immediate. Israel must lift the blockade, fully restore humanitarian access, and support UN and other international humanitarian organizations in efforts to provide assistance. China appreciates and will continue to support the work of USG Fletcher. Gaza and the West Bank are an integral part of the state of Palestine. The international community must firmly oppose any attempt to annex the territories of Gaza or the West Bank and oppose forced displacement of the population of Gaza. The United States, as a country with significant influence over the parties involved, should act in a fair and responsible manner and take effective and forceful action. The Security Council bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Algeria and other members of the Council are currently working on a new draft resolution. China supports the Council's efforts to take effective action to promote a durable ceasefire and alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe. President, the implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. The international community must step up its effort to promote the political process for this two-state solution. We look forward to the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution to be held in June. and hope it will provide a new impetus to the prospect for realizing the two-state solution. China will continue to make joint efforts with the international community to promote the quelling of fighting in Gaza, alleviate humanitarian catastrophe, realize a comprehensive, just and lasting solution to the question of Palestine, and restore peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of China for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for the important briefings, and I also thank Dr. Feroze Sidhwa for his compelling testimonies and your devotions on the ground. Mr. President, the current violence and suffering unfolding in Gaza for the last 19 months makes us doubt that we are now living in the 21st century. The recent killing of Yakin Hamad, an 11-year-old girl, bravely helping the delivery of humanitarian aid to her neighbors and reporting her survival through social media, exemplifies again the urgent need to immediately end this conflict. As we demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups, we urge Israel to stop bombing, which is indiscriminately killing scores of Palestinian civilians and destroying the entire Gaza Strip. The Republic of Korea also reiterates its firm support for the efforts by mediating countries, namely Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to secure a desperately needed resumption of the ceasefire. We appeal to both Hamas and Israel to faithfully engage with the mediators for an immediate ceasefire and release of all remaining hostages. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned by the new modalities of the humanitarian aid in Gaza, which reportedly started operations at a severely limited number of militarized locations earlier this week. We reiterate our fundamental position that Israel has a legal obligation to allow the swift and unimpeded flow of aid throughout Gaza, with full respect to the humanitarian principles and in full cooperation with trusted humanitarian agencies, including the UN. In this regard, we call on Israel to listen to the principled voices of humanitarian workers, including the former executive director of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who tendered his resignation because, I quote, "It could not adhere to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence," unquote. Not only food, but also other necessities, including medicine and medical equipment, water, sanitation, shelters, and fuel, all are desperate need. Such aid, severely limited in both quantity and access, cannot provide adequate relief to 2 million people in Gaza. Innocent civilians do not deserve such inhumane treatment. Also concerning is that Israel's humanitarian aid plan would lead to the forcible displacement of hungry Palestinian civilians in Gaza by coercing them directly through the promise of withheld food and humanitarian aid to move to areas by the distribution sites. Also unjustifiable is using civilians and civilian infrastructure by both state and non-state actors as human shields. While we demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, we also strongly demand all parties to this conflict adhere to their obligation under international humanitarian law and to hold responsible those who violate them. Mr. President, turning to the worsening situation in the West Bank, we reiterate our call for an immediate de-escalation and full respect for international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. Last week's incidents where Israeli soldiers fired warning shots at dozens of diplomats visiting the city of Jenin in the northern West Bank clearly shows that under the current occupation with severe military operations, no one, not even foreign diplomats, are safe. Under international humanitarian law, the occupying power must maintain the status quo, as detailed in Resolution 2334. Israel should cease all settlement activities in the OPT, including East Jerusalem, and any incitement and inflammatory rhetoric, especially vis-à-vis holy sites in Jerusalem, must stop. The Republic of Korea expresses its deep concern over Israel's recent approvals for the construction of new settlements in the West Bank. As the construction of settlements is against international law and undermines its viability of the two-state solution, the Republic of Korea calls on Israel to reverse its relevant decisions. In addition, we express concern over the repeated incendiary remarks and acts by senior Israeli officials, including recent visits to holy sites, unilateral actions, and incitement against UNRWA, the UN mandate agency, must also stop. Mr. President, we empathize with the international community on the concern of eroding vision of the two-state solution. By perpetuating the continuation of violence and agony or denying the existence or future of neighbors, a just and durable peace cannot be obtained. Sadly, the reality today, shown in a harrowing video of a little girl walking in flames after Israeli airstrikes targeting a shelter-turned school, is the opposite. The Republic of Korea thus reiterates its call for an end to the bloodshed and the release of hostages, and reaffirms its steadfast support for the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace, security, and dignity. As a UN Security Council member, the Republic of Korea will actively participate in discussions, including the high-level conference in June, to secure peace and revive a viable path toward the resumption of a political horizon based on the two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Greece. I wish to thank Special Coordinator Mrs. Kaag for her detailed briefing today, as well as Dr. Sidhwa. Colleagues, it has been only a week since our last discussion at the open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, where Member States emphatically referred to the unacceptable humanitarian situation in Gaza, with the most vulnerable groups, women and children, suffering the most. A child never starts a war, and yet, as Sophocles reminds us, war loves to seek its victims in the young. Thousands of children have been killed, wounded, separated from their families, deprived of the basic rights to grow up healthy, and stripped of their dreams for a better future. With each passing day, more Palestinians are at risk of dying, falling thousands. The latest IPC report clearly warns of an entire population at critical risk of famine. Hundreds face the risk of succumbing to the injuries, as hospitals have either suspended the operation or have been shut down. All this suffering could end with a ceasefire and full access to humanitarian assistance. While we welcome the partial resumption of aid delivery to the Strip, it is hardly sufficient. Much more is needed, as the population has been denied access to food, medicine, and other critical supplies for almost 3 months now. Blocking aid as a pressure lever is unacceptable. Expanded military operations in Gaza worsen the humanitarian situation. This action will only prolong the suffering of the Palestinians while doing nothing to serve the long-term interest of peace and security in the region. We urge Israel to allow the immediate, full, and unhindered flow of humanitarian aid at scale into all parts of the Strip, as it is clearly dictated by international law. Access to electricity and water must be fully restored as well. Dialogue and coordination with the UN and its agencies remain critical in this regard. We share the concerns expressed by UN colleagues at proposals to establish a new mechanism for the delivery of aid which would not meet basic humanitarian principles. We cannot support a scheme which does not prioritize the needs of civilians, undermines the UN's ability to operate independently, excludes specific parts of Gaza, and increases further instability and insecurity. At the same time, we are gravely concerned by the attacks on humanitarian aid workers. These people have chosen to serve humanity at the risk of their own lives. Hence, the safety and security must be guaranteed at all times in accordance with international humanitarian law. We strongly condemn incidents of anti-Semitism, including the recent deadly shooting in Washington, D.C., which claimed the life of 2 embassy staff members. We extend our condolences and solidarity to the families and to the State of Israel. Turning to the West Bank, we strongly condemn the incident with shots fired during a visit of foreign diplomats in Jenin, and we accept this incident to be fully investigated and accountability clearly assigned. We also deplore the increase of settlement activity and violence. Hostages are still suffering at the hands of Hamas. We reiterate a strong condemnation for the cruel treatment of the hostages, and our position that all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Colleagues, peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Both parties need to strive for a permanent and sustainable ceasefire, as well as to revitalize the political process with the ultimate goal of achieving a two-state solution, in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions. In this way, both Palestinian and Israelis will finally be able to live side by side in peace and security. In this regard, we look forward to the upcoming June conference under the co-presidency of France and Saudi Arabia as an important contribution toward the ultimate goal of a two-state solution. We also welcome the Arab plan for the reconstruction of Gaza as presented by Egypt, reconfirming the leading role of a reformed Palestinian Authority to be essential in planning the day after. There is no alternative partner for peace than a reformed and empowered Palestinian Authority capable of exerting effective governance over the West Bank and eventually Gaza, where Hamas will have no role in security of governments and will no longer be in a position to threaten Israel. In concluding, colleagues, it is evident that no good can come out of violence. It is crucial to break the vicious circle of violence that has plagued the region for decades and give voice through dialogue to peace, stability, and prosperity. I thank you. I resume now my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and thank UN Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her important briefing and her efforts. I also express our deep appreciation to Dr. Feroze Sidhwa for his compelling briefing, for his service to save wounded Palestinians, especially children in Gaza, and for his appeals for an end to this brutal war on our people. Let me also reiterate our support and gratitude to the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, to Tom Fletcher, to Mr. Lazzarini, and many others, including the heroic staff of the UN in defending, serving, and saving lives at the expense of theirs. Mr. President, there is cruelty in the bombardments, cruelty in the wanton destruction, cruelty in the blockade, and even cruelty in the distribution of very limited aid. We will be asked, how can you complain about food finally being delivered after having complained about starvation and famine? Isn't it any aid better than no aid at all? Who said these should be our choices? The doomed fate of our people. A full blockade against an entire civilian population, including 1 million children, depriving them of food, water, medicine, shelter, or a system of aid that is degrading, discriminatory, limited to food and limited in quantity, and which aims at the forcible displacement of the population and at facilitating the unlawful seizing of land. Do you know how we know this is the objective? Israeli officials are openly telling the world that this is their intention. Statement after statement, threat after threat. After seeing starvation used as a weapon of war, now we see aid being used as a weapon of war. Should we remain silent because the alternative is worse? Or should we stand up for the humanity of Palestinians, of all civilians in any situation of armed conflict? The images of hungry, desperate people storming out of the cages they were forced into in order to get aid is gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. These are people, human beings, deprived of water, food, medicine for so long and hanging to life by a thread. This is outraging the Palestinian people, all of them, including me. It is outrageous to see this situation and still you are not acting. How much more do you want? Israel wants to appear as allowing aid in, while continuing to make sure life cannot actually be sustained in Gaza. If Israel wanted aid in, it would open the crossings and allow humanitarian aid to enter immediately and fully, in coordination with the UN, including UNRWA, which proved during the ceasefire its ability to deliver aid to all those in need throughout the Gaza Strip. The UN plan, with its proven capacity on the ground, remains the only viable plan to deliver aid in line with the humanitarian obligations and principles, and it has all necessary safeguards, if that is the true concern. But the true concern is how to get rid of the Palestinians by killing them, starving them, and destroying Gaza so they have no choice but to leave if they want to live. In his speech yesterday, Netanyahu said two truths. The first is a Freudian slip, and I quote, "When you try to target civilians, you invariably hit civilians." End of quotation. And indeed, Israel has been hitting civilians. The second truth is, and I quote, "You always demonize before you annihilate." Let me repeat it. You always demonize before you annihilate. End of quotation. He was saying that as a historical lesson for all. What did he say about Gaza? And I quote, "This is the war of good against evil, the beginning of a determined war that is being waged on the battlefield. It is being waged against the human animals, that's us, against the monsters, that's us, that attacked us with hideous brutality 20 months ago, and we will defeat them and annihilate them. They will not remain. They will not remain, end of quotation. He repeated yesterday, and I quote, "This is a war of civilization against barbarism," end of quotation. We have to ask, is it civilized to bomb indiscriminately, to commit daily massacres, to kill entire families, to destroy all the requirements of life and survival for over 2 million people, including 1 million children? Is it civilized to blockade and to starve a people? If this is civilized, what is barbarism then? Is it civilized to bomb schools, serving as shelters for displaced civilians? When you see the images of 6-year-old Ward al-Sheikh Khalil, the first question should be, how did she find herself amidst the flames, which my brother Ammar showed you the picture? It is because of an Israeli strike on a school turned into a shelter. 36 people were killed in that strike, mostly women and children. Ward survived, but her mother and 5 of her siblings did not make it out of the burning buildings. And again, my brother Ammar showed you the pictures. She will forever have to live with that trauma. And as the distinguished brother Feroze told us, 50% of those who are under 5 years old are not looking for life. They are looking for death because they cannot bear the pain of losing so many of dear ones, of their families and siblings. If we stop this genocide before she is killed too, Ward. Dr. Najjar, who was honoring her noble mission as a doctor trying to save lives, saw her children as they arrived to the hospital, their bodies burned and already dead. She lost 9 of her 10 children. A horror and trauma the mind cannot comprehend. The heart cannot withstand. Since Israel broke the ceasefire in March, over 1,300 Palestinian children have been killed, and around 4,000 have been injured. These are children. Children. And still, a war against barbarism. Children. Dozens of children are dying of starvation. The images of mothers embracing their motionless bodies, caressing their hair, talking to them, apologizing to them. This is unbearable. How could anyone tolerate this horror? Mr. President, I have grandchildren. I know what they mean to their families. And to see this situation of the Palestinians without us having hearts to do something is beyond the ability of any normal human being to tolerate. Flames and hunger are devouring Palestinian children. This is why we are so outraged as Palestinians everywhere, the 14 millions of us in the occupied territories, in the diaspora, in the refugee camps, in far places, all the way to California and in between. We love our children. We love our people. We don't want to see them going through this tragedy and this savage attacks by those who claim the virtues of fighting against barbarism. But Netanyahu mocks claims of starvation in Gaza, despite the overwhelming evidence. And what proof does he rely on? That Israel takes thousands of prisoners and photographers that photograph them half naked, and that you can see they are not starving. He is speaking of the prisoners parked in trucks by the hundreds, or in the open last winter and the one before, including children. More inhumane and cruel treatment, more dehumanization, more disregard for basic human decency. Netanyahu claims that Israel is supplying the population with essential requirements: food, water, medicine. That's why he, and I quote him, that's why you didn't have mass starvation at all, he says. This is the same Netanyahu that decided to impose the total blockade that the people in Gaza endured over the last 10 weeks, deliberately denying them water, food, medicine, and shelter. This is the same Netanyahu who congratulated Smotrich, who, after the decision of allowing some aid declared, and I quote, "Now we conquer, cleanse, and stay until Hamas is destroyed. Along the way, what remains of the Gaza Strip is also being wiped out, simply because everything there has become one big terror city." End of quotation. The same Smotrich who spoke of the expansion of Israel's border on all fronts, inciting the crowd of Israeli extremists storming the streets of the old city of Jerusalem and Al-Haram al-Sharif on the so-called Jerusalem Day. Smotrich shouted, "Are we afraid of the world occupation?" Meaning thinking of the situation there. He shouts, "Are we afraid of the world?" The crowd answered, "No, we are not afraid." Are we settling the land of Israel? Are we liberating Gaza? The crowd cheered. Netanyahu said the objective of this destruction, Netanyahu said that the objective of this distribution mechanism was to have a sterile zone in the south of Gaza where the entire population can move. And he has repeatedly said that Israel wants to depopulate Gaza, calling it voluntary migration, the code name for ethnic cleansing, and to take control of Gaza. So what should we all do. Pretend we cannot see, we cannot hear. Netanyahu is asking us not to believe his own statements, not to believe that the actions he took actually took place. He is asking you to redefine all of international law to fit Israeli crimes, to enable these atrocities. He is asking you to accept, to bargain with people's lives and with our existence as a nation, and with peace and security for all in our region. He wants to define the terms at the expense of everybody else. His political survival relies on it. We all know this. We have known it for a long time. Nearly 200,000 casualties between killed, injured, and have been the consequence of this. So what should be condemned? Genocidal statements and actions, or statements and actions to prevent the genocide? What should we condemn? There should be no character assassination of those who stand against these brutal policies, while those behind them are never held to account. We should see the truth. We should see clearly. For our part, our position is clear and unequivocal. Nothing can justify attacking civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. Double standards no more. We are human beings. We are proud Palestinians. We sit around this table. We should be treated exactly like everybody else. Not to see what you want to see in the mirror and to ignore the obvious, the huge elephant in the room, the Palestinian people. Be fair. Use one stick of measurement. We are like the rest of you, all of you. Don't have a system of measurements for one group and pretend the others do not exist. We do exist. And although I love Mansour, the Palestinian artist, who my sister, Sigrid referred to him, we will never wither away, we will not go as Palestine. Although he said in that famous artwork that he see that Palestine is withering away. But he probably was referring to settlements and other issues. But I can assure you, we are rooted in Palestine more than the olive trees, the Roman ones, rooted in Palestine. We will never go away. We will not wither away. We are staying and we will attain our inalienable rights, hopefully sooner than later. Okay. For our part, our position is clear and unequivocal. Nothing can justify attacking civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. We reject dehumanization and double standards. Palestinian lives are not less important, less sacred, less worthy of protection. Mr. President, President Trump, together with Egypt and Qatar, is making every effort towards a permanent ceasefire that could end the killing, release hostages and prisoners, begin to end the horrific humanitarian situation, lead to the withdrawal of Israeli forces. The Palestinian Authority is ready to fully assume its responsibilities in the Gaza Strip, both in terms of governance and security, with international support and presence. President Trump said he wants to see peace prevail in the region. That is the Trump plan, not the distorted version promoted by Netanyahu to pursue the war. It is time for all states to do what is necessary to end this genocide, break this siege, end this illegal occupation, achieve the independence of the state of Palestine and the two-state solution and peace. That will be for the benefit of all states and all peoples, Palestinians and Israelis and the entire region. If the Security Council does not act, there is nothing that prevents you from acting in your national capacity. Act in your national capacity. Do something. Stop this crime from continuing against the Palestinian people, this genocide. Let's not try to shift the blames of those who are not acting. Show us your true character, your commitment to international law, your commitment to justice. You can act. And by acting in your national capacity also, you might inspire the Security Council to act in its collective, powerful capacity. This is not a so-called reward or gift. This is the right of the Palestinian people to life, to live as a free people, to live in peace, security, and with human dignity in their homeland, side by side, in peace and security with Israel. These decisions can no longer be deferred. States must act within these halls at the national level, collectively, and at the upcoming international conference in June. They need to show that their resolve far outweighs the will and sinister plans of the enemies of peace. Free Palestine, as hundreds of millions of people are screaming in the streets in every corner of the globe. Free our region from occupation and wars. It has all gone on for far too long. The human toll and suffering are more unbearable than ever. There must be an immediate ceasefire. There must be unimpeded humanitarian aid and protection for our people. Hostages and detainees must be released. The forced displacement of the Palestinian people and annexation of Palestinian land must be stopped. Save Gaza. Save Palestine. Save the two-state solution. Save peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. What? No. Yes. Okay. I see that the representative of the United States has asked the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I just would like to very briefly respond to some of the comments that we just heard, and to say that Israel does have the right to defend itself and has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and address humanitarian needs. And while the loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic, the responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could stop the fighting today by freeing the hostages, and agreeing to the ceasefire terms already accepted by Israel. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. And now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Mansour, you mentioned our Prime Minister many times in your speech, your long speech. I want to remind you the words of our former Prime Minister, Golda Meir, who served 50 years ago in this position, and she said that peace will come when you will love your children more than you hate us. Mr. President, a bright young couple in their 20s were in the prime of their lives dedicated to diplomacy. Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram were stars in Israel's foreign service, working in the diplomatic team at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. They were deeply in love. Yaron was planning to propose to Sarah this week in Jerusalem, but they never made it to Jerusalem. A week ago, last Wednesday night, as they were leaving an event for young diplomats hosted by the Capital Jewish Museum, they were shot dead, murdered by a terrorist screaming, "Free Palestine, free Palestine." This was a targeted anti-Semitic assassination of two Israeli diplomats on American soil. This was anti-Semitic terrorism of the most horrific order. It was an act of pure evil. The animal who pulled the trigger was just the final link in a chain of incitement that stretches across social media, across university campuses, across valleys, and yes, across the floor of this very council. The blood of Yaron and Sarah is not only on the shooter's hands, it is on every official, every influencer, every academic, every anti-Semite, every so-called expert who has spent the last 19 months portraying Israel as a genocidal regime and terrorists as freedom fighters. But we cannot talk about such recklessness without talking about Mr. Tom Fletcher, who sat here a few weeks ago. Mr. Fletcher has assumed the role of moral preacher. His speeches and statements drip with pomposity and self-righteousness, but not a shred of responsibility. Just a few weeks ago, in this chamber, he accused Israel of genocide. I have demanded the retract of this baseless and vile accusation, but he has not so far. As if that was not outrageous enough, he declared just 2 days before Yaron and Sarah's murder that, quote, and I quote him directly, "There are 14,000 babies in Gaza that will die in the next 48 hours. And you should have seen the way he spoke, like he has some information that we don't have. That claim was a lie. It had no basis in fact, and yet it was broadcast across social media, fueling the already terrible anti-Semitism. Of course, as we all know, 14,000 babies did not die in those 48 hours, but 2 innocent Jews did. Mr. Fletcher was forced to retract that lie after the BBC corrected him. But retractions don't put the bullets back in the gun. They don't bring back Yaron and Sarah. They don't erase the damage done by those who slander the Jewish state without a second thought, without thinking before speaking. Mr. Fletcher, when you engage in blood libels, do not act surprised when blood is spilled in the streets. This is what happens when anti-Semitic propaganda is filtered through the language of human rights. That is what happens when terms like genocide are thrown around like political weapons, stripped of meaning and used to demonize Jews. This council has become a megaphone for that hate, a place where the worst actors in the international system use the banner of justice to justify violence, a place where the representative of Libya can sit at this very table and desecrate the memory of the Holocaust by calling Gaza, and I quote, 21st century Holocaust. That isn't just distortion, it is Holocaust denial. And yet, there was no condemnation for most of you sitting here. You faced no consequences. At the United Nations, statements like that are tolerated and sometimes even applauded. But don't mistake the applause for morality. Words have consequences. And the murder of two young Israeli diplomats is not detached from what happens in this room. It is the logical end of your narrative. The people who chant from the river to the sea are not separate from the people who sit here in suits and ties and accuse Israel of genocide. They are part of the same machine. One provides the lies, the other pulls the trigger. Unfortunately, Mr. Fletcher is not the exception. He is the rule. He is representative of a class of UN officials and so-called neutral experts who have built careers out of moral posturing while taking no responsibility for the consequences of their words. They are very good at that. They speak in sound bites, they issue dramatic proclamations, and then when those proclamations incite hate and violence, they vanish. They deny any role in the bloodshed. Well, we will not let them evade responsibility. We will expose them. Even a day ago, I think Mr. Fletcher came with another provocation. He said 10,000 tracts are waiting to enter Gaza. I don't know if you saw that, only recently. You know what will happen if you line up 10,000 tracts from the border of Gaza? The line will go all the way to Lebanon. So how can you throw numbers like that? You can say there are issues, you can say about public, but saying 14,000 babies, 10,000 trucks, genocide, so easy. Mr. President, while the UN spreads panic and makes declarations detached from reality, the State of Israel is steadily facilitating the entry of aid into Gaza via two methods. First, under the old framework via trucks, and second, under the new distribution mechanism developed in coordination with the US and key international partners. As of now, both mechanisms are working simultaneously and will continue to do so for the immediate future. We are not only allowing aid in, but we are ensuring it reaches the people who need it most. Just this Monday, for example, 170 trucks carrying humanitarian aid entered Gaza through Kerem Shalom crossing. These trucks delivered food, medical supplies, and vaccines. Every single delivery was carefully coordinated to prevent looting by Hamas. Since May 19, almost 9,000 tons of aid have entered Gaza, again carrying food, medical supplies, flour for bakeries, and baby formula. In recent weeks, 4 new aid distribution centers have been established inside Gaza. These centers are operated by international humanitarian organizations and secured by a US civilian security company. They were created to serve one purpose: to ensure aid gets to civilians, not terrorists. 2 of these centers, located in Tel El Sultan in Rafah and the Morag Corridor, began operations yesterday. They are already distributing food packages to thousands of families in need. This is happening despite Hamas's attempts to block civilians reaching the aid by establishing checkpoints and roadblocks. Because Hamas knows if it loses control over the aid, it loses control over the people of Gaza. You know, let's ask ourselves what happened after. Have we heard any condemnation from the UN? Not one word, no statement. But that silence is not the end of the story. It gets worse. The United Nations has once again picked the wrong side. Today, I reveal shocking information. Not only has the UN refused to condemn Hamas for its efforts to sabotage the new aid centers. We have seen the pictures of Hamas blocking people. But the UN is now actively joining Hamas in trying to block that aid. The UN is using threats, intimidation, and retaliation against NGOs that choose to participate in the new humanitarian mechanism. A number of major international NGOs made a decision to take part in the new aid initiative. They decided to ignore the UN's calls for a boycott. They are allowed to do it. They said, we want to give it a try. We want to help this new mechanism. They chose to act because they truly care about what happened. The UN's response was brutal. It was mafia-like. Without any discussion, without due process, the UN removed those NGOs from the shared aid database. That database, I want to remind you, is a central system for tracking aid deliveries into Gaza. It was created and approved under a UN General Assembly resolution. But those NGOs, they were frozen out. This is the gravest violation of the UN's own principles. It is the extortion of well-meaning NGOs that refuse to kiss the ring. It is a shakedown by UN mobsters. How can they do that? If you don't want to participate, I think it's a mistake. I think there is room for humanitarian aid from all directions at this stage, but to actually threaten NGOs not to collaborate with this new mechanism, I urge the UN, do not let your egos get in the way. Cooperate with the new mechanism. It has begun and it is operational. Shift your focus from dramatic press statements and intimidating NGOs to the work you are supposed to be doing. Mr. President, negotiations for the release of our hostages are ongoing as we speak. We accepted the last offer on the table, but Hamas said no. It is Hamas that has refused every credible offer. It is Hamas that continues to use human beings, our hostages, who they have cruelly held for 600 days now, as currency. But the international pressure remains fixed on Israel, not the terrorists. That pressure only plays into Hamas's hands. It strengthens the terrorists. It prolongs the war. With this pressure, you are not advancing peace, you are advancing Hamas. Still, the simple fact remains that there can be no progress until all our hostages are released. Everyone. No statement, no resolution, no futile conference at the UN will change this. We are committed to bringing them home, through negotiations if possible, through military pressure if necessary. But we will not leave them behind. We will not apologize for defending our people from those who will destroy us. No matter how many lies are told, no matter how many blood libels are spread, we will continue to fight for the lives of our citizens and for the future of our people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Israel for his statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس يسرني أن ألقي هذا البيان.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to deliver the statement on behalf of the Arab Group. We would like to thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her thorough briefing and all UN officials, including Mr. Tom Fletcher, for their vital role within the framework of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza Strip. We also express our deep appreciation to Dr. Feroze Sidhwa for his touching remarks and his dedication to providing humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. Mr. President, since Israel's breach of the ceasefire last March, the systematic destruction of hope and life for over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza has been persistent. The brief period of relative calm they experienced during the first 2 months of this year was abruptly shattered when Israeli occupation forces resumed their attacks on the Strip, turning the fragile aspirations of civilians into haunting nightmares. The magnitude of this unfolding tragedy is painfully captured in the story of Dr. Ala al-Najjar, a pediatrician at Nasser Hospital who lost 9 of her 10 children in an Israeli airstrike that hit her home while she was treating wounded victims of the ongoing attacks. Regrettably, the heartbreaking incident is just one aspect of Gaza's ongoing tragedy. In this regard, the Arab Group reiterates its strong condemnation of Israel's complete blockade of the Gaza Strip and the persistent denial of humanitarian aid for nearly 3 months. This blockade has severely worsened the humanitarian crisis, driving the population to the brink of famine, with clear warning signs already emerging. With over 160,000 tons of food supplies stalled at border crossings, the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war is starkly evident, constituting a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Although Israel recently permitted 408 trucks to enter Gaza via the Kerem Shalom crossing, only 115 have delivered assistance, a drop in the ocean compared to Gaza's overwhelming humanitarian needs. Notably, none of these aids have reached the northern Gaza Strip. The chaos unfolded at an aid distribution center in Gaza yesterday underscores the urgent need for the immediate, full, and unhindered delivery of aid to all areas of the Strip, coordinated with the United Nations according to its 5-phase plan to reach all those in need in Gaza Strip. The Arab Group urges Israel to implement this plan without delay, fulfilling its responsibilities as an occupying power. The group also reiterates its rejection of Israel's proposed aid mechanism, which violates the principles of humanitarian action and its obligations under international humanitarian law. In this context, the group welcomes a number of statements issued in May concerning Palestine, including the joint declaration of the 16th of May issued by 7 European countries, namely Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Norway, Slovenia, and Spain. The joint statement as well of 19th May issued by the United Kingdom, France, and Canada, as well as the statement of 19th May, the same day, issued by a number of donor countries. The group also reaffirms the positions expressed in the statements of the Ministerial Committee established by the Arab Islamic Summit on Gaza, most recently reflected in the statement issued on the 25th of May. Simultaneously, Israel's military escalation since mid-May, which signals a dangerous shift toward establishing permanent control over the Gaza Strip alongside its efforts to militarize and manipulate humanitarian aid, further advances its declared objective, namely to make life in Gaza unlivable, forcibly displace its population, and seize Palestinian land in clear violation of the international law. On the other hand, the Arab Group condemns Israel's military escalation in the West Bank, along with its ongoing home demolitions, land annexation, settlement expansion, and the perpetuation of its occupation. It stresses the need to respect the legal and historical status quo of Islamic and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. The group affirms its strong rejection of any attempts at forcibly displacing the Palestinian people from their homeland and emphasizes the vital importance of the Arab Islamic plan for the early recovery, reconstruction, and development of Gaza, that was presented by the Arab Republic of Egypt in coordination with the State of Palestine and the United Nations. This plan that has received widespread international acclaim. In this regard, the group calls for providing the necessary political and financial support to this plan to ensure its successful implementation and urges active participation in the upcoming conference in Cairo aimed at exploring pathways to rebuild the Gaza Strip. Furthermore, the Arab group calls on Israel to lift all restrictions imposed on UNRWA's operations, underlying that the agency serves as the cornerstone and the backbone for the humanitarian response in the occupied Palestinian territory and embodies the international community's commitment to the rights of the Palestinian refugees, including their right to return and reparation as affirmed by relevant UN resolutions. The Arab group reiterates the urgent need to end the Israeli aggression on Gaza and demands Israel to commit to the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, to lift the blockade and resume the ceasefire in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2735. The group also calls for ceasing all violations against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian workers, including medical personnel, as well as the protection of civilians and the release of all prisoners and detainees. In this context, the Arab group commends the ongoing mediation efforts by the Arab Republic of Egypt, the State of Qatar, and the United States, aimed at achieving a permanent ceasefire, facilitating the resumption of humanitarian aid, the exchange of prisoners and detainees, and the complete withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from Gaza. Mr. President, the ongoing cycle of suffering, displacement, and loss of life in Gaza over the past 19 months is a profound stain on the conscience of humanity. It is imperative that the Council rise to its historic responsibilities and adopt a resolution that decisively and permanently ends this war. Any delay in doing so will only exacerbate the suffering of civilians and cost more lives. Accordingly, the Arab group urges the Security Council to engage constructively with the draft resolution presented by Algeria and supported by several Council members. The resolution calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, the removal of all barriers to humanitarian aid, and its distribution in accordance with established humanitarian principles. As we look ahead to the high-level international conference on the two-state solution scheduled for June, co-chaired by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France, we stress that the success of any diplomatic effort hinges on genuine political will and clear commitments from all parties to achieve peace. Accordingly, the Arab group calls upon states that have not yet recognized the State of Palestine to do so, and to provide political and financial support to the Palestinian people, the State of Palestine, and its sovereignty over the entire occupied Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem. The group also calls for putting an end to violations of international law and all attempts at annexation and displacement, supporting the Arab Islamic Reconstruction Plan, and provide international protection for the Palestinian people. In conclusion, the Arab group reaffirms its unwavering commitment to working with all partners toward a comprehensive settlement of the conflict based on the two-state solution and relevant international resolutions, a settlement that ensures ending the occupation, establishing an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital to pave the way toward achieving a just and lasting peace, as well as security and stability across the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.